This is an aquarium, but it's far from what it appears to be. Rather than relying on a sponge, canister, or hang-on back filter, the water is instead processed through unconventional means, this waterfall within a closed terrarium. I was recently reminiscing over some older projects that I made, and I realized it's been quite a while since I've made experimental and kind of wacky things like the bog orb filtered Riparium and the Upflow Overflow Infinity Aquarium. The bog orb filtered Riparium was made possible through these glass orbs. A pump circulated water from the aquarium through holes underneath, where it would pass through layers of substrate, ultimately spilling over back into the aquarium in a continuous loop. Here, beneficial bacteria processed the water alongside terrestrial plant growth. These did an excellent job keeping this aquarium pristine, with virtually no upkeep required other than water top-offs. Now that's my kind of aquarium. Meanwhile, the Upflow Overflow Infinity Aquarium worked in reverse. Water instead traveled through the bottom of the aquarium, which would fill and overflow into a tray full of substrate and plants. It's a similar concept that looked incredible, but I think the orbs were more effective because this one was plagued with algae. While different, those designs utilized some similar components, but I think that there's a way I could combine the two of them with a unique twist that will be really cool, and that's where this tank comes into play. To do this right, I needed a shallow display tank. Although I could have built one entirely from scratch, I decided to dismantle and modify this one instead. I've used various tools over the years to do this, but I've really been enjoying how well snap blades cut through. It's easy to keep them parallel to the glass without anything getting caught. That said, razors are still the best option for the time-consuming process of removing silicone. I could have scraped the glass clean, but it's easier to use Barkeeper's Friend. It removes gunk that is essentially part of the glass with ease. Just be sure to give it a good rinse afterward to remove all the cleaner. I've been using this for years, and it makes the glass look like new. Before making my cuts, I used tape to indicate how the glass should be oriented. There's nothing worse than discovering it's wrong when you've already applied silicone and are trying to put it together. I've done that more times than I'd like to admit, even after measuring twice. I recently got this 12-inch speed square and I love how it streamlines the process, but what's even better is this new tool. My trusty glass cutter of over 10 years finally broke, which meant it was time for a replacement. I'm glad that happened though, because this new one is awesome. Having a proper handle makes the already easy task of scoring a line even easier, but the wedge on the back is a game changer. After scoring the top, you just line it up on the opposite side and slowly tighten the handle until the glass snaps. It's kinda difficult to cut glass this thick otherwise, yet this makes it a perfect cut every time. What I will say though is that regardless of the tool, it always has a break-in period. It needs to be used a couple dozen times before it will work as well as you see here. Anyway, I'll link this up in the video description along with my entire glass processing toolbox. Finally, those sharp edges had to be buffed out. I generally tape up the inside before running the silicone beads. I also like to apply anchoring tape to the front and back so it's ready when I join them together. In the past, I used to clean the glass before adding the tape, but I find it easier to do it like this. When glass is thick and heavy, it tends to press out all the precious silicone that's needed to hold it together. Luckily, there's a solution in the form of bumpers which will eliminate this issue altogether. Ideally, you want to use ones that are the same color as the silicone, but I only had clear ones right now. Anyway, I applied it and assembled it as usual. I did things differently on the inside though. Normally, I'd run an interior bead. However, I taped this to create a minute seam, so whatever pushed through was enough to complete the seal. This turned out well, and while the silicone cured, I considered my options for the terrarium. Should I use orbs like in the Riparium, or maybe some type of jar or container? There's always the custom route like the Infinity Aquarium, which is what I ultimately decided on. I used this foam as a reference and got to work. I cut the glass as before, but because it's thinner, I was able to break it on the table's edge. That said, the wedge comes in handy for these tiny pieces, which can be challenging to work with otherwise. The assembly process here was a little different because of the smaller scale. I knew trying to remove tape for the beads wasn't an option, so I decided to freestyle. I'll admit my application was sloppy, but I wasn't stressed. None of this would be visible anyway. That is, except for the ones on the front. Rather than try to smooth it out or anything like that, I simply scraped off the excess while it was wet. It's pretty difficult to plan these builds entirely from the start, and they often change as I'm working on them. As I thought more about this one, I realized that the Upflow filtration system as seen in the bog Riparium would probably be the best option here, but I didn't initially design it to include such a feature. Now I have to make modifications after the fact that could be detrimental. That included the need for a bulkhead to have a clean connection to a pump. The issue, however, is that I'd have to drill through the glass, which would be kind of difficult because of how small this is. I was able to support the inside though to reduce the risk of cracks. I spent all the time to make this, so I didn't want to ruin it now, and thankfully I made it through without any issues. My stress was alleviated, and it looked awesome after I cleaned up the silicone. After installing a bulkhead and a few elbows, I got to work on the next feature, a divider. This would create a compartment where the waterfalls originate. Once the silicone cured, it was ready to go. What you didn't see earlier is that I designed this so there's a gap in the front where water can spill out. This unfortunately caused instability in the bottom platform. Before I could fix that though, I stuck a piece of screen to the bottom of the opening so only water can escape. Then I supported the underside with another piece. Finally, I had to create some support for the terrarium. I kept it simple and stuck some scraps together to make these T-supports. I figured they'd be strong enough, but there was only one way to find out. Thankfully, even without silicone, it held up well. When I went to stick it all together, I added bumpers to the ends of these to ensure enough remained even under the weight of the terrarium. Naturally, it all had to cure before I could clean things up and add the finishing touches. Since it's a rimless tank, I put it on a leveling mat. I also installed frost film on the back and tubing on the elbows. I do believe it would have held up fine as is, but the top moved slightly. For good measure, I made these spacers out of PVC board that have mounting tape on them. I'm extremely pleased with how this enclosure turned out, and I'm so glad to finally be done building it, because I just want to get in here and escape. Since the terrarium is lifted above the aquarium, I thought it could look cool and less jarring if it appeared like Hardscape was propping it up. I had some Mupani wood that could work well for that, but it wasn't easy. It was a challenge because the branches just didn't want to stay in place. I experimented for quite a while, and eventually I achieved the desired effect. However, branches alone wouldn't be enough. Some stones could embellish this and provide more stability. I prefer to create as much of a design as possible before applying adhesives, but it's not really an option with these weird scapes. This one was no exception. Using expanding foam makes this task easy because you only have to wait about 15 minutes between steps. My goal here was to hide the T-supports as best as possible. I'd install a few pieces, add the foam, pick off the excess, and continue. I also wanted to have some of the branches look like they go through the bottom of the terrarium to join the environments together in one cohesive design. I marked these jungle vines and did my best to cut them at the same angle to align properly against the glass. I often have to prop things up as I work using whatever I can find. However, what I've never used before is duct seal putty, and it helped a lot. It allowed me to hold elements with ease between steps, like applying silicone. And once that cured, I was able to remove these elements. I was trying to create the foundation for a waterfall in this area, which was more or less the same process as before. The only difference was really that I used the flattest stones as possible and was more mindful about where I applied foam. It did eventually come together, but I knew it would look even better with more texture from spiderwood. Like the jungle vines, I wanted these to appear like they went through the container. The duct seal putty trick from earlier came in handy to line them up, but I used epoxy to lock them in for good. I also made it appear as though a vine was coming through the side. However, all of this left me with unsightly epoxy, which is where superglue and cocoa fiber came in to make it appear seamless. I finished things off with some detail branches and expanding foam near the top of the waterfalls to promote flow. Aside from a few minor details, the scape is pretty much complete, and everything I've done till now has led up to this point. I've made a lot of different setups in my time, so I believe this is going to work, but you never know for sure until you get the water flowing. I hooked up a pump, filled the tank, and hoped for the best. I guess I haven't actually made enough setups after all. The flow just wasn't as strong as I expected. I thought mixing in sphagnum moss to wick water and filling the back with the biological media would improve the flow, but it didn't. After running some tests, I realized it was because of how I plumbed this. The tubing was just too small to provide enough water. Unfortunately, I couldn't run a bigger one without making my own plumbing pieces. Luckily, I have a lot of fittings and other items I could use instead. I cut a piece off of this random thing because when combined with an O-ring, it could act just like a bulkhead for a larger tube. I did a test run just to ensure it could work, and it was better than ever. I finalized this all simply with a vinyl tube and a hose clamp. That meant I could put focus on the terrarium. I'll only briefly discuss what I did here because I changed it later, but it went as follows. I placed a few small stones for added definition, followed by a layer of aqua soil. I wanted this terrarium to include a lot of moss, so I put it everywhere. Java moss is always kind of flat when you first add it, but it gets a dense and upright look as it matures. Either way, it was great to finally see some green in the design. Then I added a top dressing of gravel and sand before placing moss on the bottom as well. Moss wouldn't be enough though, I worked in Anubias and ficus too. Because the container is so small and there are waterfalls, I was kinda limited on what plants I could include. When I came up with this design, I imagined a forest in the aquarium. That said, it took a lot of trial and error to get something I felt matched the hardscape. Initially, I filled the bottom with a mix of aqua soil, gravel, and sand. With the jungle, I figured the appearance of substrate didn't matter as much. However, even with cloudy water, I knew this wouldn't look right in the end. I decided to take it apart and try again. That included the bottom of the terrarium because I wanted to maximize the cohesion between the two environments. This time I laid a foundation with substrate bags to better control this area's appearance. Then I built up a layer of gravel that matched the dragonstone and filled the rest with sand to add finer textures. I used the same gravel in the terrarium to keep with this theme before putting the other items back. Since I planted the aquarium dry the first time, I figured I'd get a better feel this time with water. The result wasn't much better though, because when I looked from afar, I realized how sloppy it appeared. It also took away from the hardscape I painstakingly created earlier. As I considered my options, I realized the answer was right in front of me, the Firewood Paludarium. It's simple, yet looks appealing, and provides an excellent habitat for the fish. With this less is more inspiration, I went at the scape entirely different for the third and final time. I stuck with just a few plant species instead of using 10 plus like I did before. I was also more strategic about where I placed them. My goal was to get the best impact possible from them while retaining the appearance of the hardscape. Speaking of hardscape, I added a few additional elements on that front as well. I think these helped and in some ways made it easier to plant the remainder of the items. As I saw this foliage fill in, I felt like the terrarium could use more as well. Photonia seemed like a good option because it could grow outside the terrarium as well in a riparian setting. I mixed in spider plants and some floaters too. Here's what I was left with. I think this is much stronger than the previous iterations. The temptation to get too complex is always there, but I think I struck a good balance with this one. I'm really pleased with how it turned out, and I think it's a cool concept, but like all new tanks, it's going to have to mature to look its best. But I think we should add the fish. They wouldn't be alone though, because I had already added some Amano shrimp and snails. Alongside the terrarium filter, these will help maintain this environment for a group of sparkling gourami. Most were shy about entering their new home, but once they did, they disappeared. Let's give them a minute. Oh yeah, and it turns out that Samantha and the other yellow shrimp in the lily tank went wild. Now that I have a ton, I figured I might as well add a group to this tank. A few minutes later, and the fish's inquisitive nature was beginning to shine through. What's this snail on about? What's going on over here? And who's watching us? In all seriousness, it was incredible to see them enjoying this new aquarium. It's a little wacky, but it's a simple concept. The water is sent through rocks or it's processed by beneficial bacteria and further addressed by the plants here and in the tank. Based on what I've seen with past setups like this, I believe it will be pretty low maintenance and fun to watch develop. Safe to say if you made it this far, you enjoyed the video. It takes a lot of time and effort to make these, so if you wouldn't mind supporting the channel with a like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, I'd really appreciate it. If you want more, I've linked up 2 other aquarium builds I know you'll enjoy. Until next time, Serpa Squad, take care and peace.